make a start. As mentioned, good evening, and thank you very much for taking the time, especially on a Friday evening, to join this discussion. Safe to say, it is certainly a topic of interest. So, by way of introduction, should you not know me, my name is Zekeng. I wear several hats, but at the core of this, I am a scientist by training with a PhD in infectious diseases. I am a policy advocate for health, gender, and youth. And I'm also founder of SökerData, essentially combining all of the above to increase diversity in clinical trials, not just at the patient recruitment level, but so phase 1, 2, 3, but right from trial conception, design to execution to improve overall health outcomes. So to this end, over the last 5 weeks, we as a team have conducted research to understand community perceptions around this topic. And in honor of World Clinical Trials Day, which is actually tomorrow, we are joined by this fantastic panel to discuss this topic. So just to orient you on what to expect for roughly the next hour and 15 minutes, the panelists are going to present an introduction of themselves. I'll share the results from the research we've carried out. We'll have a brief discussion with the panelists on essentially what the current state of the land is in the backdrop of COVID-19. Then we shall move on to the next segment, highlighting the current sector's response to regulations, forward-looking strategies to move the needle towards this space, and finally, the role employers play in sustainable implementation. So without further ado, I would like to pass it on to our panelists to please make an introduction, and I will start literally with how you are on my screen. So to the top left, you have Dr. Tade. So can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Elsa. Hi, everyone. So my name is Dr. Sarah Tade. I'm a GP registrar, and I am currently working in West Essex. I also have a special interest in healthcare and inequalities, in particular, tackling the disparities with maternal health outcomes. I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the Essex faculty for the RCGP. And I'm also on the Race and Health Observatory as a maternity advisor. It's a pleasure to be here today. And thank you again, Elsa, for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tade. Next, you have Dr. Acha.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Ginny Acha. I lead the Global Regulatory Policy team at MSD. I'm also, I happen to be based in the UK, which is a handy thing for me, something I enjoy very much, and also very relevant because our company is, has undertaken a lot of clinical research in the UK. We are an important investor in research in the UK, and as part of our global strategy, and particularly with lessons learned after the pandemic, we are absolutely keen to make sure that although, we aim to provide medicines that support all, we can't do that without involving everyone in the research. So it's critical for us to move forward with improving access and participation from populations that maybe previously were either unsupported or overlooked or underrepresented. But this is such an important topic for us. I'm really glad to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Acha. Next, you have Dr. Madad.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Sarah Madad. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist and science communicator, as well as a biosecurity advisor. I currently serve as a senior director of the system-wide special pathogens program at New York City Health and Hospital. So I'm in the United States. Also do a lot on communication, both science and risk communication. I'm a fellow at Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and then faculty at a couple of different institutions. And so a lot of my focus deals with community engagement, outreach, and how we're communicating the science and the risk and other activities to the general public.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Madad. And next you have Emma Lowe.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this, Elsa. My name's Emma Lowe. I'm the Head of Research Policy for Clinical Research and Growth at the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK. And I lead a programme of reform around how we make a great environment for clinical research in the UK, working across England and also with my equivalents in the devolved administrations. And as part of that, one of our real focuses is how we make sure that we are designing research in ways that centre around the people that most need to access the research and benefit from it, and also the people that are operating the healthcare systems that those people are accessing their care through, to make sure that research is as fit for purpose as it can be. And I really passionately believe that this is essential if we're going to have a really evidence-based healthcare system in the future. Thanks, Elsa.
Thank you very much, Emma. And last and certainly not the least, we have Lee Chambers.
Super, a pleasure to join you today, and unfortunately not in the place where I expected to be, so yeah, apologise for any background noise and music that's going on. So yeah, I'm Lee Chambers, organisational psychologist, founder of an inclusive wellbeing company. I'm a Catholic Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. I do a lot of work around wellbeing initiatives in the workplace and looking at inclusivity, accessibility, really kind of looking at the impact of organisational cultures, climates and systems on marginalised and minoritised employees. And obviously, when it comes to looking at an ability to create a medically more diverse, stronger and more appropriate future, whether that be culturally or from a more kind of clinical perspective. Obviously, this is a topic that is quite close to my heart, and I appreciate some of the challenges that the community has from a side of accessing and feeling that there's a level of trust, but also the economic circumstances and some of the barriers and obstacles that face certain groups, and how employees can be a part of actually bridging those gaps, dismantling them, and creating a more equitable access to trials. So yeah, pleasure to be with you.
Difficult, I'm muted. Thank you very much for that, Lee. So without further ado, I will jump straight into the data and share what our research has found over the last 5 weeks. So as you have just all heard, this is our panel for the next hour. So as I started up mentioning, again, if I'm looking at another screen, I'm not looking away from your panel. This is literally just looking at another screen. So we carried out this research to really understand what the community perceptions are on the inclusion of data from Black and ethnic minority communities in clinical trials. Started off trying to understand what the impact of COVID-19 has been in terms of how these communities engage and trust with the government, with institutions like pharmaceutical companies and the media. Going on to understand and define what the concerns and bottlenecks are as it pertains to engaging with clinical trials, and then assessing what the response is currently on some of the strategies that have been developed. So the target sample, we carried out 3 focus groups, about 30 participants, and this was distributed across the ages of 18 to 30, highlighting there that the ages of between 30 to 35 were at about 37.8%. The ethnicity, we had a high percentage of Black, African/Black British, Asian British, also included white, English, white European, and 13%, Black Caribbean, and other ethnic groups. So safe to say, about 80% were Black and ethnic minority communities. The scope was specifically focused in the UK, so ran the gamut of London, Manchester, Birmingham, Wales, Lancashire, and some other cities not mentioned. So, starting off to understand how the management of COVID-19 made these communities feel, I think something that was very top of mind was that this led to an increase in mistrust in the government, with 26%, well, with participants stating that there was a 26% decrease in trust in the government compared to their trust pre-pandemic. And we define trust as the likelihood to believe the information that they were being presented and using that information to make an informed decision. 84% of the participants stated that the communications and engagement around COVID-19 vaccine, COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine was confusing, often stating that it was fragmented and disconnected, and it led to feelings of anxiety leading to mistrust. Also heard other comments such as misinformation and disinformation. And lastly, 56% of the women stated that the main challenge that they had was inaccessibility to their GPs, limited access to routine checks. And I thought this was very interesting because it very much was highlighted within the women participants and not specifically the male participants. So that's something that I think is always interesting when we're looking at the inclusion of different groups. So obviously the question was asked after explaining and going through rounds of explaining the need for clinical trials. And interestingly enough, 78% of the participants stated no, they will not engage in clinical trials, whilst 22% stated that they're more likely to engage in clinical trials. Some of the reasons that were listed, top of the list was 50% a lack of knowledge around clinical trials. Next, you had around access to trials, and then 16% and attitudes and beliefs and lack of trust. And lastly, 5.57% stated logistical issues and practical issues. Now, again, I found this quite interesting because when we talk around lack of trust, attitudes and beliefs, the thought process around what the lack of knowledge plays around clinical trials is clearly very high and is listed very highly as a concern around engagement with clinical trials. So what came out in terms of understanding what their attitudes were when we're talking around this lack of knowledge? So perhaps this is a personal bias, but when I've always thought about the lack of knowledge, it's almost easy to think you have to over-index on education and making sure that there's an awareness around the clinical trials, that surely we can engage and let them know that this is something that's happening, these communities are more likely to take part. But clearly, the participants really highlighted that their concerns were more so around the adverse events and knowledge around what sort of adverse events, not necessarily the knowledge of the clinical trials. And I pinpointed these 4 specific quotes because on the top left, you had someone stating that, yes, they understood the need for clinical trials. However, they were more so anxious about the later effects and if it causes any issues in the long term, what that would look like or what that would present for them. Conversely to this, on the top right-hand corner, you had a participant stating that if the incentive for clinical trials were for private insurance, should any adverse events happen in the future, then perhaps they were more likely to participate in a clinical trial. And then on the bottom left, you had almost a sort of similar issue there, but highlighting that the concern that were more around clear results, the effects in people, and stating very much that just seeing that 89% of people in a specific race have participated in the clinical trial were not really beneficial to them, were almost inconsequential. They were thinking about wanting to sort of create a profile and understand what are the factors and what are the effects that these patients had. And last but certainly not the least, young people stating that they don't get taken seriously and highlighting that these are groups that often felt like they were gaslighted by medical professionals and they wouldn't want to be involved in clinical trials. So to this end, I will turn this now back to the panelists, and my question to you as a panelist, and I will stop sharing my screen here, is do these insights surprise you? Or what are your thoughts towards these insights? And what do you think this tells us about the lay of the land that we're currently operating, especially in the backdrop of COVID-19? And here I will start with Dr. Madad.
So first, thank you so much for sharing those results. I think they're really, really important. And I'm so glad that you conducted that study. Here in the United States, I think we certainly are seeing something very similar. First, it's, we have a lot of lack in trust in science and establishments and scientists along with the scientific process. And very similarly, here in the US, we're leaving this pandemic with less trust than we did entering the pandemic. So the results of the study certainly do not surprise me. And I think it shows that we have a lot of work cut out to do as we talk about, pandemic preparedness and prevention and making sure that we are all ready for the next outbreak, and not just even the next outbreak as we talk about clinical trials and the importance of developing different therapeutics and medications and the like. Really, really important that we have a much better, communication strategy, both from the message and the messenger standpoint that certainly we'll get into later on. But thank you for highlighting this study. Not surprising, but again, shows a lot of work cut out for many of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madad. Again, happy for anyone to probably highlight if they would like to go next, but I think based on the policy aspect that you've just touched on there, I would like to bring in Emma from your perspective in terms of shaping policy going forward. What are your thoughts regarding to this research and how we're moving forward?
The thing that I was thinking as Sarah was talking was about there's something here about pandemic preparedness actually needing to be baked into how we do things normally. And in some ways, what we saw in the pandemic was the positive thing was we had a lot of ability to do clinical research around the world. We had lots of things that were ready to go and we were able to act on things very quickly, but also the ways of operating and the things that were detrimental to that for particular communities and also around our healthcare system were also baked into that as well. And so there's something for me about the I'm not surprised to see that the trust has gone down. I'm actually surprised that's not higher up in the second slide that you showed in terms of what would affect the decision to participate. So I'm encouraged that people would be open to learning more about it. And while we were talking about a pandemic, this is true of everyday healthcare. This is true of every medicine that you access, all the treatment that you access every day should you need it. And there's something about us really thinking about how do we bake that in to the way that we do healthcare normally, so that in a future situation we don't have the same issues.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. I'll go to Dr. Tade. I know Emma's just touched on everyday healthcare, and considering your role as a primary care, what would you say, Dr. Tade, are your thoughts regarding this?
Thank you, Elsa. Again, I echo what Dr. Medad said, that the data was really, really good and very necessary. I'm not surprised, especially I would say the statistic that stood out the most was how much of your participants just felt that they just couldn't trust getting involved in clinical trials. Before I touch on health aspect solely, I would like to provide a bit of context. I think it also stems from a historic distrust and also a present distrust. So if we look back at clinical trials like the Tuskegee experiment in America, how awful that was, for example, and how that broke every single ethical code. People might say, oh, we've moved on from that. But more recent times, we can look at what Pfizer went through, scandal in Nigeria with meningitis when they were trying to, I think, create a vaccine for meningitis. And again, so many ethical codes were broken. So then it would bring a question, well, why should we trust you when we've looked at these clinical trials where every ethical code was broken? Now, what we have to understand is that the mistrust is not just isolated to healthcare. We have to look at all of our pillars of society, education, policing, social care, and so forth. If you're constantly seeing inequalities within all of the pillars of society, then you're going to get the same issues in healthcare, for example. So I think I would echo the statistics with referencing Professor Marmot's review. We have social inequalities because of social injustice and the social structures that discriminate. So again, what do I see and how can I relate this to my experience in primary care? Again, you will see patterns of different health outcomes depending on the socio-economic class of where you're working. So if you're in a more affluent area, you'll have people, if they can't get their GP, for example, they'll go private. However, if people are in a lower socio-economic class, they may have other struggles that may be stumbling blocks to them going to their GP, and then they are not in that position to go private, if anything. So it's multifactorial. It's not just health, it's all the pillars of society. But what is encouraging is that we're having these conversations and we're looking at how we can change it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tade. I'll go to Lee next, especially from the community aspect and your experience that you've seen on ground. What are your thoughts and reflections around this? And I mean, I know we're going to go into a lot more depth later on, but on a high level, sort of your feelings on ground and the strategies moving forward.
Yeah, so kind of mirroring Dr. Tade, you know, the systemic inequity that exists within all institutions and pillars kind of collaborates to create an atmosphere of distrust that is difficult to break down in isolation. Obviously, you know, collaborations across different facets and factors that we're able to, you know, bring together through this can make a difference. But yeah, from a community perspective, trust in any institution and system. You know, people have felt like they've had promises broken. People feel like, you know, they've been the world is changing and potentially becoming more equitable, but they're not seeing the actions behind some of the words. And, you know, given that I work generally in an organizational context, there is so much now around distrust for ethnic employees, you know, whether they be global majority, but really, you know, in the UK, around promises were made around workplaces becoming more equitable, and now companies are starting to drift on that. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. Hear very similar things in the community, and yeah, there needs to be action taken beyond the words and beyond the talking.
Thank you very much, Lee. And last and certainly not the least, Dr. Hatcher.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to follow on from what Lee was saying, because I think it is so important that, you know, once you've lost these points of trust, it's really, it's a very long road back. So take the Nigerian example, that was late 90s, but that's what people remember. But they don't know what the regulators have been doing since then. So they don't know that we now have ICH guidelines, which means that there's no way I could get any of my studies approved that would breach those codes, because it would be blocked in clinicaltrials.gov. It'd be picked up immediately. So, you know, we've got efforts there, and FDA now is moving ahead on diversity and inclusion requirements. So we now have reporting requirements that will ensure our now we've hit, for our company at least, we've got over 50% of our trials are from represented by participants who come from previously neglected or underrepresented groups. So it's not 100% yet, or it's not, you know, as full as it may be, but it's progress. But does anybody know that? How would they know that? And part of the problem is, I think it's not a case of having no information, it's having too much information, and not all of it necessarily well curated or substantiated. And I do worry. I mean, you know, from family friends who have questions, and you can't blame them. They read newspapers, they listen to podcasts, they're listening to whatever's going on, even a Zoom webinar. They're getting information from lots of places. And I think Dr. Madad mentioned, you know, some of the figures that are really quite shocking, even in the States and globally, that have come out recently. I think I saw an Edelman report come out maybe a month ago, where actually the real shocking comment was that people were more likely to trust a friend or a family member about medical advice than their doctor. Mm-hmm. Now that's a real breakdown, and I'm not saying that's only in these you know, our diverse and multicultural backgrounds, but you know, it didn't define who was answering the question, but I think it's generally held. So you have to say that, particularly in communities, we have to make a bigger effort. So I was looking at your list and thinking, well, we can kind of work on all of those, and we are already working on some of those, but maybe we need to do them better. And I'll just give one last example we did during COVID-19, because, you know, we saw in COVID-19, you were not getting representation in the right ways, particularly for those groups who were at most at risk from COVID-19. So we had to actually come up with something creative and get actually some mobile testing labs to bring them into the community. So instead of asking people to come to us, we went to them and included some important outreach and explanations there. But, you know, it's one good example. That's not going to solve it, but it's creating an agenda and momentum that comes off the back of that, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asher. But so I think, well, now we're moving on to the next segment, which is really much looking at the current sector's response to some of the requirements and policies, as you've actually touched on, and specifically even more recently in 2022, the FDA requirements to increase diversity in clinical trials and overall the impact on health systems. So coming back to you, Dr. Asher, I think since the COVID-19 response, since the pandemic, the pledges have been made and the requirements have been put into place. How are various industries reacting to this? You've already just touched on some strategies such as the mobile lab, but what else would you say is being put in place? But more so specifically, what have you found to be working, or is it too soon to say what is already working?
Well, it's not. There are some good examples of things working. So, like I said, bringing the trial site to the participant rather than expecting them to come. I think there's some nice programs that people came up with The Beacon of Hope projects in the States have come up with some nice examples where, you know, it's the smallest piece you had in that list of logistics, but it still matters. So if you can provide people with like a Lyft or an Uber service or something, it helps. But I think one of the important things we had developed under COVID-19 was actually something we weren't necessarily intending to, and that was much more virtual clinical research. So we had to have ways of delivering products to patients. We had to have ways of having more remote visits and collection of data. And that's only because the hospitals really couldn't sustain clinical research at a time when they were already overwhelmed with treating COVID-19 patients. And you didn't want to bring participants into an environment where they would be at risk. So you had to come up with creative ways. Now, for some communities, particularly those in a rural setting, that can be quite helpful. So they didn't have to travel an hour and a half to a clinical trial site. That can be useful. But everything comes as a blend and a trade-off. And I think where we need to have more of the conversations, because I've heard some important feedback from some patient representatives who said, for some patients, they didn't actually like the solitude of it. They missed having time to connect with their trial nurse or, you know, some of the doctors that were supporting them, because they asked them other questions. So we need to think about, okay, virtual, but what else? How else can we support participants in that setting? So I think we're learning. I think this has been an active process, and I don't think that's going away. I think the good news is most trial work, whether it's contract research organization or academic sponsors or commercial sponsors, I think everybody's looking to see how do we make the best of that sort of a hybrid outcome. And I think that can be, you know, it does help. It can be a useful way, but it does bring up its own set of issues, and not something that, you know, you should go in full on. You should want to, you know, test it and get some direct feedback and understand directly from those participants you're trying to integrate in what would be the right solution for them. And a co-creation of strategy, I think, has got to be not necessarily something we had the time to do in COVID-19, but something that we need to make the time to do now.
Thank you very much for that. That is absolutely very helpful. I'll come to you next, Dr. Tade. I know you're a GP in training and you have you've had obviously shared your specific interest in healthcare inequalities. So based on your experience and knowledge, and to improve overall healthcare outcomes, especially in some other areas such as maternal health, what role does the NHS play? So we've obviously just heard from Dr. Asher as to what the private sector is sort of doing. Now we're moving on into what is institutions like the NHS, what role do they play in tackling these disparities with minority ethnic women? As again, we highlighted, we saw the difference in women wanting to have access to their GPs and routine services. What would you say?
Oh, sorry, my screen has gone funny. Can I still be heard and seen?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you've highlighted about the disparities within maternal health care. I won't take it for granted that everybody knows the data. So just so that everyone is on an equal playing field roughly in terms of what is the data, why are we hearing about disparities? What does that even mean? Well, unfortunately, when we look at health outcomes with pregnancy and labour, and we look at Black, Asian and white women, there are not equal health outcomes. So in the United Kingdom, Black women are 4 times more likely to die. Asian women are 2 times more likely to die than white women in pregnancy or labour. Just to put that into a little bit of context, labour and pregnancy are safe, but it's out of those that fall into the category of complications within that particular data set. That's where we're seeing these disparities. And this is the recent data. I believe it was published by the House of Commons Women and Equality Committee report. And then what is upsetting even more is the fact that Black women have higher rates of stillbirth or neonatal deaths as well, in comparison to their white counterparts, for example. So these statistics are distressing and worrying. And if we just put race on the hold for a second, and if we just look at the socio-economic class, for example, women who are living in more deprived areas continue to have the highest maternal mortality rates. If we put the race hat back on, it just so happens to be in the most deprived areas, you are more likely to see ethnic minority women. And some people say, okay, well, why are we having these disparities? Is it because of pre-existing conditions? Is it because of being more at risk of high blood pressure, for example, or type 2 diabetes? Whilst Black and Asian women may be overrepresented in those disease groups, it does not fully explain the maternal disparities that we're seeing. So again, it's hitting back to the social inequalities once again. We're seeing that it's the lower socioeconomic class, greater risk of poor health outcomes. And essentially, if we think again about Professor Marmot and his review, it all links into social inequalities, which then leads to social inequities. So now to answer your question, we've got these statistics and we understand what's going on in terms of the data and the disparities. What is the government, what is the NHS doing about it? So there are some initiatives that have been set up. So I would say that in itself is encouraging, because what we don't want is just talk and more reports and more data, and then there's no action. So as I introduced myself in the beginning, I mentioned that I am a member of the Race and Health Observatory that has recently been set up in response to trying to challenge some of these disparities. An initiative that is, I believe, that was commissioned by NHS England. And the idea is long-term change. So you're having experts, you're having people who are campaigners. For example, the 5 Times More campaign group, heavily involved in it as well, chief midwifery officers and so forth, the list goes on. So a vast range of people who are sitting together, not just talking about more statistics and more data, but trying to change policy and trying to put things in place that can bring long-term health outcomes, even introducing some screening programs. There are some things I can't say yet because it's just still in the pipeline. Essentially, work is being done to try and make lasting change. So it's not just the Race and Health Observatory. I believe there was another initiative that was commissioned by NHS England, the Core 20+5, that's specifically looking to tackle healthcare inequalities, and maternal health is one of them. And then what was recognised as well is that one of the big causes to being for there being a barrier is when you meet a clinician and you don't know them. That's when all the prejudice or the discrimination can come into play. So what has been recommended, and there are targets for this, is having continuity of care for women throughout that journey of pregnancy, labour and post-labour. And the NHS England do have a target. By 2024, they want to have 74% of Black and minority ethnic women to receive that continuity of care from their midwife throughout pregnancy, labour, and that postnatal period, postnatal meaning after you have delivered. What I think is encouraging is that we have a date, so by 2024, and we have a specific data set, so 75%. So that's encouraging because that way we can hold some level of accountability if that hasn't been achieved. Furthermore, I don't want to concede the time, so I'll just make it quite quick. One last key point that has been changed as well is recognizing the lack of ethnic diversity in leadership positions, particularly in maternal health care. So when we're looking at midwives, senior midwives, it's discrimination in terms of why we're not seeing more Black and Asian women in these leadership positions. So what I would say is encouraging is there is that recognition and there is a drive to try and change that. There is, I wouldn't say it's surprising that in London there are more Black and Asian women in senior medical leadership positions than in the North, for example, but it's still not enough. So I am aware that there is a pilot scheme, I think in the Midlands, that is giving Black and Asian and minority ethnic midwives, for example, that opportunity to step up into that leadership position to help bring down some of these barriers that we're seeing in discrimination, to help with that level of career progression, development. And obviously we know that when a workforce is more diverse, not just at bottom level, but but at the top, then what we can see is more powerful change, because you get different perspectives and hopefully less of that discrimination whereby there's that barrier, or that person doesn't look like me, they don't understand me, or let me assume that they're angry, let me assume that they are eating the wrong kinds of things and causing themselves to be self-inflicted with diseases. So all of these prejudices and assumptions don't really help. So in summary, we can see that there are changes by driving forward new institutions in terms of health observatories that are bringing forth action, diversifying leadership in terms of having more ethnic minorities in leadership positions when it comes to women's healthcare, and recognizing the need for continuity of care.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Tade. That's quite elaborate. And as much as I really want to move on, but there's something that just kept coming to mind, which is a point that I heard in some of the focus groups where a lot of the participants stating that why would I engage in a clinical trial when there's several other issues that have constantly plagued our community, such as maternal health, that have not been addressed? And why would I then trust a system that is asking me to, is now says they care about one other thing? Why would I trust that system? So my question here, again, very quick response, obviously, if you can just give me that on that, your perspective on that is, do you then think that by addressing these other issues, such as maternal health and these other issues plaguing the communities overall, that goes on to address other things, such as like increasing diversity in clinical trials? So it goes beyond just maternal healthcare. Do you think that is, it doesn't no longer just affect just that one vertical?
That's a very good question. And I would say that, yes, it will. I personally believe it will help, because when we were in the peak and the thick of the pandemic, and again, there were the disparities and inequalities in who was coming to get their vaccine and the vaccine hesitancy, one of the main barriers that people felt was, okay, but you don't care that we're dying in healthcare. You don't care that police are killing people in custody, but you care about us taking a vaccine. So when people can see evidence, oh, okay, well, these statistics are worrying and disturbing, and the government alongside NHS, they're working in full force to try to change this. They're not just talking about it and producing more and more reports. They're actually putting policy in place and creating change. So I believe that when people are seeing these things, it can actually give that sense of hope to be like, okay, well, you do care, so maybe I can trust you in other aspects. So I do think it's definitely a step in the right direction and can help to bring down barriers that have been put up and been really hard to get through. I think it's a step in the right direction to bring these barriers down.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Tade. Okay, so we're moving on to very much the next segment. As we obviously heard in the statistics, a lot of the criticism, and I would say, around communication and engagement. And as of course we saw this with COVID-19, whether that was from the government, from pharma, or from the media, communication strategies were very much critiqued, and almost we all lived by the letter of what was being said on the news almost every night. I'd like to bring Dr. Madad in, very much looking at the communication strategies and policy development. In your opinion, what kind of communication strategies do we need to implement, and very much looking at the vehicle as well as the message itself? So yeah, what, if you can give us some few thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to highlight one particular point here in the United States, just highlighting the stat for maternal mortality here. Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from preventable pregnancy-related complications than white women, and that risk spans all income and educational levels. So we are unfortunately in the same boat. So a lot certainly has to happen here in the United States as well. A couple of things I'll first mention as it relates to communication and clinical trials. There's a lot of different reasons for underrepresentation of minorities and underrepresented communities. And, a couple we've already raised, in this discussion so far, which includes trust and historical mistrust. And we've seen underrepresented communities have experienced historical injustices and unethical practices in medical research, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study, which has led to deep-rooted mistrust. And these historical events continue to influence attitudes and contribute to skepticism about participating in clinical trials. We've also seen cultural language barriers. And so language and cultural differences can pose barriers to participation. and many clinical trial materials are only available, particularly here in the United States, in English. So it makes it very difficult for people with limited English proficiency to understand the study details and even just the basics of when we talk about informed consent. And then there's also lack of awareness and access issues. So we know underrepresented communities have limited access to information about clinical trials due to socioeconomic factors, language barriers being one of them, as I just mentioned, inadequate outreach efforts, and the like. And so as we look at developing a better communication strategy and have better equitable access to healthcare and ensuring underrepresented minorities and communities are represented in clinical trials, there's a lot that we need to do and can do. One is increased community engagement. We want to make sure that we're actually partnering and collaborating with community-based organizations, faith-based groups, advocacy groups, and enlist trusted community leaders to raise awareness about clinical trials and educate individuals about their importance. We want to make sure that as you are engaging in within communities, you're developing culturally appropriate educational materials and disseminating them through appropriate and targeted outreach campaigns and channels. You want to also make sure you're improving trust and transparency. So actively addressing historical mistrust by established, transparent communication channels and building relationships with minority communities, making sure you have open dialogue about history of unethical research practices and the like. And so making sure you have that two-way communication is just so important. And something that's also been already brought up is diversity among trial investigators and staff. If you're going to be enrolling in a clinical trial, you want to know that these are the people that not only look like you, but also speak your language. So encouraging diversity among trial investigators and staff helps build trust and enhance cultural competency in trial recruitment and engagement efforts. The last couple of things that I'll just mention when it comes to just the communication and the message and the messenger is first knowing what your communication goals are. I think oftentimes, you are setting up a clinical trial or setting up some sort of an activity or an event where you want obviously diversity in it, but you don't have a goal in communication. So the first start in Communication 101 is defining your goal. Is it changing a behavior, an action, soliciting information, or recruitment of individuals? The second is knowing your audience, right? So gauging their level of understanding, and the 5 W's come into play. So the who, the who, the what, the when, the where, the why. So as it relates to clinical trials and research, what is this clinical trial? Who's conducting it and who's participating in it and why is it important? So making sure just the basics are really there in a culturally appropriate way, in a way that people can understand and relate to, and the communication strategy is there. And then also just making sure, as you've highlighted, just the basics and logistics and study specific questions like the cost or the financial burden, the transportation, the time involved, making sure all that information is accessible and is communicated in a way that people certainly understand. So a lot that can be done, that should be done, and we have the tools and resources to do it. So it's really important that we work on many of these strategies collectively, and it's an all of the above approach. It's not just one and done, but it's all of the above.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Madad. I think we'll come back to some of the points you've raised perhaps later on in the Q&A. So I'd like to bring in Emma. I think very much considering the announcement around the end of COVID-19, right, as a pandemic by the WHO, how do you think this has affected, or this is affecting various stakeholders' commitment? I think we're all saying, yes, it's encouraging that a lot of development is being put in place, but there's also the fear/risk, right, that if it's no longer an emergency response, or if it's no longer pending or just hanging above our heads, there might be a decrease in commitment. So how do you think this will affect the commitment to increasing diversity in clinical trials, and how can we really ensure that this remains a priority in stakeholders' ways of working and policy settings?
I think the first thing I'm thinking about is actually whether the pandemic, from a clinical research perspective, actually did change policy around diversity in trials. And I think from a UK perspective, I'm not entirely persuaded that it did, actually. I think that the wider changes that happened in terms of really thinking about the diversity of who participated in particularly the vaccines research, for example, only really happened when the vaccine was being rolled out. And that there were challenges around mistrust across lots of different parts of society, but particularly people who were most at risk of COVID-19. And seeing people not want to take the vaccine and being faced with the reality of that in a global emergency. I think that really helps to change people's minds. But I think it's really indicative of two things. You know, one, to be absolutely fair, as Ginny mentioned earlier, the need for speed was really acute. And so actually just getting to a vaccine was the priority. And we do need to not forget that we were in the dire state that we were in, and the need to progress. However, because it wasn't baked in, because diversity wasn't baked into the way that we did trials, and we hadn't already done the work that we're talking about here around mistrust and how do we reach people that most need to benefit from these advancements, that wasn't baked in. And so questions about did the people that most needed to participate in these studies, you know, were kind of met with silence in some ways around, and we're not, and we still aren't able to answer some of those questions. So I think one of the things that in some ways I think really reinforces that as well is if you look at some of the work that happened around learning from the pandemic of how would we do research differently in a global context to make sure that we are developing vaccines and treatments together and making sure that the research that happens is as actionable as it can be. Some of the work that happened while the UK had the leadership of the G7 was the development of a therapeutics and vaccines clinical trials charter. And there's a lot in there about how we do this quickly and we make sure that we can share data and that we don't waste participation in clinical trials and do lots of research that's not going to have outcomes. But diversity is not mentioned once in the text of that document. So I think that the lessons around making sure that the people, you know, the challenges that we then saw around uptake would be addressed, I'm not sure have really been learned as a result of the pandemic. And I really don't think that they were baked into how we dealt with it until we started the rollout. But I do think that there is cause for hope. I do think it's changing, and the fact that these conversations are happening, and I think the examples that have been given and the data that's available, and you know, everybody I think has mentioned something around actually the conversation here has changed, and a large part of why the conversation changed was all the other things that were happening during the pandemic as well. The Black Lives Matter movement, there's so much more conversation about women's issues, around women's health and the lack of evidence around care and treatment for women's issues. We certainly wouldn't be having day-to-day conversations about menopause in the way that we do today 5 years ago. There's a lot about how we talk about healthcare that's changed, and people voicing that mistrust and voicing feelings of being gaslit by their clinicians and feeling like the healthcare system doesn't serve them. And while all of that was true when people were saying those things before, I don't think that they were being listened to, and I think that they are today. So I do think that that context is starting to change, but I'm not personally seeing that. I'm really encouraged actually by particularly what Ginny's described, because when I'm at work and talking about policy issues, that sense of needing to bake diversity in rather than speed, which I think has been the main thing that we've focused on, speed and efficiency, and how we develop things more quickly, almost at the cost of how do we take the time to make sure that the people most need it participate, is not something that I see very much in my day-to-day conversations, and was part of the reason why I was so keen to be involved in this conversation today. So I think that there are broadly two things that we need to think about, and I have to say this is definitely in conjunction with all the things that people have raised, because this is obviously in a much wider context. But I think the first is about really thinking about who are we serving. Clinical trials are intended to provide evidence for improved treatment and prevention. They do not exist for their own sake. They are about the outcome to change practice. And that, from a policy perspective, I think because you kind of get to the scientific end of a trial, and often whether it's in a company, in a university, in a policy department like mine, we put things in boxes, and often it's just the trial bit and then the uptake bit is completely separate. And actually really being clear about who needs to benefit from the outcomes of the trial and thinking about that right from the start is quite a systemic change that I think needs to be given more attention. So if you know that a particular treatment is intended to serve a specific subgroup of the population, I think we have got quite good actually about how do we best serve those people, how do we reach out to them and engage them in a study. Where something is for the general population and intended to serve almost everybody, then I don't think that kind of how do we bake in really making sure that that is truly representative of our population, and knowing whether needs are different for different groups. We're not capturing that evidence as we go, because it's not really a part of the question properly. So I think really focusing in on what the true outcome of clinical research is intended to be. And then the second thing is kind of the same thing, but from another perspective, because I think if you were to say to scientists, and I'm conscious that there's a number on the call today, that you need to pay attention to that, I'm sure that they would feel that actually they are, and that's why they come to work, and that's why they went into clinical research and became a scientist. So I think that's quite a challenging kind of message to give. But I think the way that research works, and the way particularly in academia works, is that the reward comes from the publication and the purity of the data, and being able to really generate something that says very definitively this has had such, you know, a particular impact, when actually to really know that some things worked and the outcomes of it, they are much broader than that. They are about the kind of things that Dr. Tade was raising. Are we seeing changes in really meaningful outcomes for patients? And I don't think we pay very much attention to that and reward that in the way that our science structures work. And so if we really want our researchers to behave differently and design studies in a different way, then we have to reward them for doing that. And that's the kind of thing that I really grapple with as a policy official, of how do I pull those levers and make sure that we can create these kind of changes in the system. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. So I think it's safe to say we can have this conversation for a very long time, but let me not go too far deep into follow-up questions. Lee, I'd like to bring you in, very much bringing on some of the topics that we have heard around, right, which is very much communities, baking into who is at the center, who are we serving, and very much as the communities. And of course, we know that we probably spend 70% of our lives at work, and very much under our employers, sort of the rules and regulations sort of set around us. I guess my question to you is, in your opinion, what is the role that employers have to play in supporting this engagement, right? I think we've touched on how we've changed the conversation around menopause, healthcare, women's health, you know, wellness at work. What is the role that employers play in really much increasing and supporting the continuous sustainable participation of diverse communities in clinical trials?
Yeah, and I think organisations have a responsibility, but they also have an opportunity. If we kind of think about, you know, workplaces kind of forging wellbeing strategies and diversity strategies, and actually starting to look at this, how do they, you know, communicate? How do they, you know, create culturally sensitive initiatives? And a lot of organisations now are starting to look about how they can bridge that gap, because there's a clear gap there, gap in opportunity, gap in accessibility, gap in, you know, potential. But I think for organisations, they've got to think really, what are the barriers? There's so many barriers that organisations can work towards making a difference. If I think about, you know, specific marginalised and minoritized groups in the workplace, there are, you know, from a percentage perspective, it varies, but a significant amount, you know, a higher percentage on 0-hour contracts, for example. And the stability of those roles, to be able to go and partake in trials when, you know, your contract can be pretty much very quickly removed, it just creates an atmosphere where it's a lot less accessible. In fact, it becomes prohibitive to even engage in trials because of the nature of your employment situation. Things such as the ethnicity pay gap play a role, because again, there's often a financial element towards taking trials and having, you know, to remove yourself from a workplace for a period of time, down to care responsibilities as well, and that how they aren't often considered in that wider process. But I think every organisation has a range of opportunities and a range of considerations when it thinks about what role it can play within a more diverse clinical trial landscape. I think firstly, employers have to create those flexible working conditions, those policies which create accommodations, you know, adjusted schedules, paid time off, an ability to actually, you know, create conditions so that the groups that are considered hard to reach, and they're not necessarily hard to reach, you've just got to think about how you reach them. And within organisations, you've got already ecosystems that exist that quite often might have access to a diverse group of people, and utilising organisations to spread this message can be quite powerful. because, like you said, a lot of people spend a lot of time in the workplace, connected to the workplace. I mean, whether they feel that they belong there is another question quite often. But an ability for organisations to create those flexible policies and really be able to use those as a way to make trials accessible to the majority. Because at the minute, from an employee perspective, what I see, trials are accessible to a minority, and it's only ever going to be a minority who are able to, then utilise and access the trials. And employers can play a significant role in actually creating equity. Financial support to dismantle the barriers, support with transport, compensation for time taken. Organisations need to be putting a little bit of money where their mouth is when it comes to actually supporting the increased diversity in trials. And they need to see that as an investment, because ultimately understanding and having a much more, valuable set of data to work from for future medical interventions, medical advancements, even the preparedness of the future. If we can get organisations to think, actually, we're going to remove some of those barriers, we've got an economic weight behind us, we can do that. We're actually invested in the future, invested in creating health that's more equitable. And, everyone is impacted by that, because, everyone who's working for you can benefit quite often when organisations actually think about how they can do that. Another thing that I suppose is really important from my perspective is that employee assistance piece, and that can be around support, guidance, counselling and information. And just, employees sometimes are that trusted conduit, that communication tool, and they can even talk to people in sector-specific language, which causes a whole range of problems, but can make medical topics feel more relatable, make people feel like they are supported through that process, and potentially offer additional things around that from what they already have. But I think that for me, an ability to actually weave that into pre-existing workplace wellbeing initiatives to continue to promote that message of the importance of inclusion, access in healthcare. But some of the things that I've seen that I think are really beneficial, partnership and integration into workplace wellbeing, into the strategies, being part of streamlining communication and fostering inclusive health, utilising the fact that, there's already programs that a lot of companies are running. You can add the ability to really create an education and awareness and a system that supports clinical trials and, gives people some of the information that's valuable. Obviously, we know like misinformation, disinformation play a big role in creating those barriers, and employers are generally in a trusted position as long as we obviously got a relatively inclusive culture and people feel psychologically safe to actually access these services, which obviously in some workplaces is something they need to work on before we even get to that stage. But workplaces can and should be looking to create culturally appropriate, responsive and sensitive wellbeing initiatives and collaborating to facilitate outreach. Companies can use the fact that they have, an outreach ability that's often greater than medical and research facilities themselves, both internally to employees, but also out into the communities where the businesses exist, where quite often they have a place identity and a level of trust. So yeah, kind of wrapping it up, education and awareness, employers have a role, really showcasing the significance of this, but more than ever, promoting health equity and being an organisation that contributes towards medical advancement, to preparedness for future challenges, and actually plays a part in, increasing the accessibility and actually making a landscape where people can access these clinical trials and companies remove some of those barriers.
Thank you very much for that, Lee. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll direct to some of the panelists, and then obviously looking at time, ask for some closing remarks from each and every one of you. So the first question, which I'd like to direct to Jeannie, Dr. Acha, and is very much around wondering if the experience around the speed and efficiency of the development of the vaccine, considering it was an emergency situation versus a typical and standard vaccine, looking at how that speed and efficiency played a role in impacting, or should I say influencing, different communities' attitudes and beliefs around the sector's willingness to engage. in your opinion session, what you're seeing right now and the strategies you're currently putting forward. I know you mentioned mobile labs going into the different communities. How are you finding that or do you find, I guess is really the question, that there's barriers to the attitudes and beliefs, and do you find that there are questions around that speed and efficiency versus the sustainability aspect of it? And also, how are you obviously ensuring that there's that continuous sustainability? Is just like increase in investment, or what is the company doing to make sure that continues?
Yeah, I think I think one thing also to flag up was, we had a double whammy challenge under COVID-19. So we, of course, some companies, including my own, in fact, we were involved in 2 vaccine developments and a therapeutic, and actually only the therapeutic got that far. So we had a lot of activity, and how that happened was companies like ours pretty much put other things on park and moved all effort into COVID-19. But realistically, you couldn't do that. So we couldn't just say, oh, those clinical trials we were doing in oncology and in cardiovascular disease, yeah, we're not going to do them anymore. You couldn't. That's nonsensical. And certainly it would be a considerable waste and that would break trust with the clinical research trial participants who were already enrolled in the trial. So we did everything, and I think this wasn't just my company. All of the companies I know did the same. Moved heaven and earth to try and find those alternative methods that I mentioned earlier. I think what that did was it forced our clinical teams to really challenge the way they work, to become far more nimble in response, but also to become much more attuned to clinical and local needs. And I think that is where, as much as I think we've got a great conversation to be had here in the UK, because I think perhaps that's been a little more progressed in the US. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the FDA has now formalized the requirements. So even if you weren't thinking about it as a clinical trial sponsor, you are now, because it is going to be required. And it's good that it is. It needs to be addressed. I think your point, Emma, was so good that, instead of just thinking about speed and time to recruitment and completion, the quality of that recruitment process matters. The way we do information, the way we do consenting, the way we publish, all of these things matter. So company like mine, I don't think is unusual, but we now have a division, a group of, they're not thousands of people, but a good number of people who this is their problem. This is their project. They need to improve the way we do a better job of recruiting appropriately and engaging appropriately. And I think that that is not reversing. I think the advantage is what we've seen is not just it's an obligation, but it's a benefit. It improves the quality of your studies. It improves the outcomes for all untold, but it needs to be done as part of a broader agenda in partnership with the communities, in partnership with those representative populations, in partnership with the governments. So the other piece that I really liked that both Dr. Madad and Dr. Tade mentioned, and even Lee Chambers, when we were talking about, changing organizational approach, we are doing that as companies. So my own company has been very profoundly investing in better approaches on DEI goals. And, I love it. I learn so much every day about what new things are being tried. And it's a bit of pushing and pulling, but you get there. Same thing has to happen in the healthcare sector. So we're one of many companies, but we are supporting the Beacon of Hope project in the state, which again, that project is trying to increase the number of minority and underrepresented populations to go through medical education and become PIs. And we're partnering with the, I think it's called the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. It's ACRP. And we all talk in acronyms and then we forget what the words meant. But ACRP has a great program where likewise, they're supporting students through clinical research. And again, the focus is on supporting those underrepresented groups. And we should be doing that in the UK. We should be doing that everywhere. And I think that's where, if we can help get a research system that reflects the society they're addressing, I think that's just going to work a lot better. And I think, again, we all have a role to play, companies for sure. And I don't think it's going to happen just, by consequence of time. I think it's going to happen because people take it seriously. Somebody champions this. Somebody takes it forward. So Elsa, I think you've done a great job today of leading that charge.
Thank you very much for that, Ginny. So again, cognizant of time, is another question around communications and mistrust, and I'm sure Dr. Madadi, I'll be coming to you regarding that. Very much the role. What sort of strategy? We know we've sort of touched on this earlier on, right? So I think when we're addressing communication strategies, there are two things that we're trying to address: trying to convey the information, but also trying to address the underlying mistrust, right? So as it pertains to clinical trials, are there specific methods / vehicles that you would say need to be addressed or need to be used? So just reflecting on some of the comments I heard from the focus groups, some people stating they would rather not see a celebrity take a vaccine on camera because it looks quite performative and it doesn't really send a message. It does the opposite effect. So yeah, what are your thoughts around that, and how do we use those to address this information?
Well, I think the first thing is it has to be tailored, right? So it's not just using one type of method. It's first know your audience, and so it depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it and what you're trying to get out of it. So if you are trying to get a younger population, then maybe getting a celebrity is the way to do it, because it that resonates more with that particular age group. If you're looking at it from a different age group or a different perspective, then there's different methods. So I think there's no one specific strategy. It's just really knowing your audience, who are you trying to recruit, who are your participants, what are their backgrounds or ages, and obviously you want to have a diverse diverse group in that sense. And so employing multiple different strategies would be key. In my particular role, I have helped with a lot of the vaccine communication and outreach for New York City, and also at a national level. And we often look at it from a vaccine uptake standpoint. We often look at it from the 5 C's that I think could also go across from a clinical research and clinical trial perspective. And these 5 C's that help address vaccine hesitancy, increase vaccine uptake, and provide more trust in their in what they're getting is confidence and trust. And so a lot of work needs to obviously happen in confidence and trust, and making sure communication is building that confidence and trust in what you're trying to do. Trying to also tackle complacency. A lot of times people think, well, I don't necessarily have to do this because the risk is low, or the severity of the disease doesn't necessarily matter to me. So as that translates into, for example, clinical trials, knowing that this is something important and why it's important to have diversity and having representation. So making sure you're getting to that in your communication strategy. Looking at it also from a convenience standpoint, that's the 3rd C. So removing barriers and access, making sure that's part of your communication strategy of how convenient it could be for them. And then looking at it from a context standpoint, looking at the socio-demographic characteristics of the population that you're trying to recruit. So, I think all of these strategies really need to come into play. And the last thing that I'll just mention, and this is something that we've certainly found extremely valuable as we look at outreach, collaboration, and communication, is really bringing on behavioral scientists. I think that they have been one of the unsung heroes of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we look at it from all different ways, not just from clinical trials, but also just our overall method of communication, whether it's communicating changing guidance from science or public health perspective, the changing risk factors, is bringing in experts who are experts in communication, particularly with behavioral scientists, to help shape that message, and then making sure you're getting the right messenger to actually convey that message. So you may have a faith-based leader, but you can give them that information that resonates with their population, and having it come from them would be even better. So I think all these different strategies certainly play a big role.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Madad. And again, crunching on time. I'll come to you next, Lee, then Emma, then Sarah, Dr. Tade last. Lee, touching very quickly, there's a question rather around the employer's role, right? For example, in supporting this participation in clinical trials. So are you aware of any outreach programs that engage employee networks focused on women, well-being, Black, Asian, minority ethnics that could be tapped into or to sort of funnel this into participation in clinical trials?
I'll be brutally honest, I'm not seeing any that I would say are at an advanced stage. I have seen a number of ERGs doing specific pieces around the importance of health equity and really trying to kind of broach that culturally sensitive and culturally responsive therapy gap that exists. Again, if we look at the workplace wellbeing industry, it's got a significant privilege problem in itself. So it's, you know, employee resource groups are working towards, you know, making a difference there. A lot looking again around language, but employee resource groups can be really useful in terms of feedback and getting some data on what the challenges are, because they are often more trusted spaces, and can quite often, you know, you can get some pretty good qualitative and quantitative feedback from employee resource groups on what they think employers should do to help bridge that gap, and what are some of the gaps that they have in terms of actually looking to access and wanting to be part of creating a more, you know, equitable future in healthcare. So yeah, quite often down to utilising, but a company needs to actually, you know, push at just how important promoting health equity is, and then employee resource groups can really take that because they're quite often under-resourced themselves.
Thank you very much for that, Lee. Coming right next to you, Emma, it's very much a question around, we've touched on policy implementation very much in the UK. I mean, we've also acknowledged that the US, the conversation is probably a lot further on in the US. But there's a question around implementation and these strategies in low and middle income countries. So what are your thoughts around these sort of strategies to be implemented? And I guess what role does the UK play in sort of supporting the development and the inclusion of low and middle income countries in these conversations?
So from a UK perspective, we do fund researchers and research programs in lower and middle income countries, with the intention of them very much being in control of that research and it being responsive to the health needs in that particular country and the population that they're looking to serve. What I haven't really seen, and I kind of, in seeing the question in the chat, it seems so fraught with complexity as well, is how do we take research that we're operating in the UK or might be operating in multiple developed countries and or higher income countries and do the same research in lower and middle income countries. And I think given the examples that we were talking about earlier around Tuskegee and Nigeria and other places, it feels like something that sounds good in principle and is definitely something that we should explore, but also we need to make sure that we're doing it with the needs and kind of the concerns of those countries and their populations very much in mind. So I'm sure that there's a lot to be learned from it, but I think we could do a lot that's very well intentioned without really thinking through the potential unintended consequences for those people.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. And last but certainly not the least, Dr. Tade. I know earlier on you touched very much upon the strategies that are being put in place by the NHS and all the different institutions and initiatives. If we flip that round, what role would you say, or would you say that there is a role that the communities instead have to play in, one, their access to the GPs, access to this institution? So what's the responsibility, would you say, would you place on these communities in ensuring that we can reach and move the needle towards this?
Yeah, really good question, actually. What I think is important is to be an advocate for your health. Because sometimes doctors, clinicians, healthcare professionals can get it wrong. And we know that medicine is not strictly a science, it is a bit of an art as well. So, for example, if you feel that you're not being heard, if you feel that the advice that you've been given, you want a second opinion, you are entitled to a second opinion. One of the things that I've come across when I do health promotion talks within various communities is people say, oh, I didn't know I could get a second opinion. I just thought if that was what I was told, and that's final. So in that kind of way, being an advocate for yourself, giving yourself that extra responsibility to push. If you feel you know your body and you feel that actually I'm not completely comfortable with what I've been told, or I just want a second opinion, then absolutely you can do that. So that's putting responsibility back on the patient. In terms of the community at large, I think Dr. Madad had mentioned using community icons. So for example, in Black and African Caribbean communities, for example, whereby the church or the mosque might have a huge influence, we can look to speaking to imams and pastors to create a space to have talks like this, so that their congregation can learn and just be a bit more empowered in that regard, for example. I would also say the voluntary sector. I know the voluntary sector is pressed quite hard anyway, but just to continue doing what they're doing in terms of community initiatives to promote health awareness, exercise programs, for example, eating healthy, and those sorts of schemes can really, really make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tade. And on that note, 4 minutes over, we have come to the end. I'd like to express my utmost gratitude to each and every one of you panelists for sharing your insights and taking the time, to all the attendees who logged on, who logged off, who messaged and said, or like a recording, we will be sending that as well later on. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your Friday evening with us, having this conversation. This is certainly not the end. I think it's very much the beginning and highlighting all the different ways we can work collaboratively together. And yes, the beginning of many. And thank you again, and wishing you a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Elsa.
Thanks for hosting such a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Elsa.
Thanks, Julie.